In this video we're going to continue with vocabularies. So we have here two versions, 1.0 and 1.1, and of course I can't change it once it's been published. So one more time I have to copy version 1.1 and go back and paste it to the vocabulary name. And now I have a version 1.2 that I can modify. And so I want to right click, add new definition, and what we didn't have time to cover in the last video was this first choice here, constant value, range of values, or set of values. So when we click next, you're going to give it your name, and let's call, let me think, I'm trying to think of a good example here. So this is where knowing your data, of course, really helps. Let's suppose that we want people to live in their home again at least 15 months or more, or say 1 year. Let's just make it a year or more than a year, more than 12 months. So we're going to call that with that very friendly name, like live there more than a year. So here we're going to say, but we're not going to put the word year, minimum time in current residence. Okay, so we're abstracting whether it's a 10 or a 12 or an 18, how many months, and we're going to put it here as a constant value. Okay, and so we click constant, we go to the next screen. It is going to be an integer. It copies the same display name, and then the value, let's say, is 12. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and save that. I hate to save and publish because you know what happens. Now I'm going to have to copy it when I want to change it again, right? So now I have version 1.2, and now we had here okay, that's time on the job. We're looking for time in the residence. So residency status rule says if time in months of residence is greater than or equal to 3. So this is where I think you can see we can make this a lot more readable. So first of all, we're going to get rid of this time of residency, and we're going to put here months in current residence. And then instead of saying 3, sorry, what I do is hit the delete here, and the 3 goes away and it becomes a generic argument again. And now I'm going to copy this value, and notice the symbol here is like a little right arrow, and I'm going to drag that there. So now it says if months in current residence is greater than or equal to minimum time in current residence. So now, also, and that's kind of cool, notice when I put the mouse over it, it says 12. So it's actually going to that vocabulary and showing me the value of that constant, which is 12. So again, what we've done is created a level of abstraction now so that if and when the users change their mind, which the users never do, right? The business people, and they say, well, now we want them to live there 15 months. So rather than changing the rule, all you have to do is change your vocabulary. So you come down here, let's do the copy. We have to paste it again. And we would now say minimum time in residence. And then here, no, sorry, we would, double click on it. That brings up this little wizard guy. And here you could change it to 15. Click Finish. Save. Publish. But the bad news is, again, this is where it gets a little weird, is that you see here, this rule, sorry, if we bring up the property window and click over here, it's telling you that that's coming hard-coded from version 1.2. So what they really need here is a, you could say go to vocabulary, that's kind of cool. So if you say go to vocabulary, it takes you exactly to which vocabulary it is. And again, you'll notice here that it's actually in version 1.2, which still had the value of 12. So from what I've seen here, I've never done this in the real world. What I'm saying is I've never used vocabularies for this specific purpose. So what would be nice is if you could just change the vocabulary and boom, you wouldn't have to change your rule. But from what I see here is, unless you write some slick utility, you're still going to have to go back to your rule now, and you're going to have to delete it, and then you're going to have to come to the new vocabulary and drag it again. So again, I think that's kind of a shame. It's kind of sad the way that's the way that works, but that's the way I see it. So probably the best way to get around that is to do the following. Don't use constants. Use a database, right? So we could actually define another table over here in our database. Let's say new table. And I always like to have an ID on my tables, which is actually, I don't think we need an ID because this is going to be a table that should only have one row in it ever. Just thinking out loud here. Yeah, so let's just try to make it one row. And let's put in here minimum time in residence. And make that a decimal or an integer, whatever it needs to be. And we'll have here minimum time on job. That's also an integer. And then any other fields that you would want to put in here, you could. So now we're going to close that. It still kind of bothers me we don't have a key on it. And let's call this business rule parms, parameters. Because I've seen tables before, like you can't delete certain rows if it doesn't have a key. So I'm still debating whether you want a key on this table or not. So now, where's my table? There it is. It's sorted to the bottom for some reason. So now if I say open table, we could put in here 15 and time on job 12. So now we've stored a row in that table. And now we could go back to our business rules and see, rather than changing the number in the vocabulary, we change it. We have a vocabulary that points to the database, but we don't hard code these constants in our vocabulary as constants. So what we need to do is delete this as a real constant and now make it a database field. So what we'll do is right click, copy and paste again. So you can see we're already up to the 4th version of our vocabulary and we're just getting started here. So now I would take this, I'm going to copy the name because I want to use the exact same name. So now I'm going to delete it. I'm going to click here, add new definition, and I'll go back to database or column, put the name in there, browse to that database, and now I'll go to Northwind. The table name, business rule parm, and there's my field, minimum time in residence. It's going to be a get. Okay, so now we would go back to this rule, and here, see, it's still showing me it's 15 because that's the value in version 1.2 or 1.3. So I need to delete that, and now I'll put here current time in residence. Oops, hasn't been published, so I have to save and publish my vocab. Now I can drag it here. So now my rule is a little more dynamic than using a constant. It's not tied to a specific, well, it's still tied to a specific vocabulary, but that vocabulary is now tied to a database table, and then the point is we can easily change that table anytime we want. So we go to this business rule parms now, open table, and then we should be able to change this from 15 to 18, like that. And so back to the business rule composer. We don't get the mouse over anymore because obviously it's not going to the database and reading that table every time we mouse over that field. But at runtime, it's going to go read that table and then use the appropriate value. So let's just do a test and make sure everything is still kind of working here. So I've changed a couple rules. I really don't need these new rules that I added. So let's delete that one. Neil demo shouldn't hurt. And now I'm going to save, publish, deploy this rule. And now let's do a test policy from inside the business rule composer. We're going to click on our XML and we're going to add either one of our samples. Then we're going to click test down here. It ran, it didn't give us any errors. And if we look for, okay, let's look for the rule that we're talking about. So it was residency status rule. You notice there's no find commands here. Let's see, if we do Control A, Control C though, we can copy to Notepad. Okay, and then you can do finds and copies and paste and things. So let's do find residency. Whoops, did I get the name wrong? Okay, should be okay, it doesn't always give you the rule name. So I guess we're just going to have to scroll through. So here we see a comparison of 3 to 15. What was that? So the field name it's comparing here is, that's the time on the job. And let's just keep scrolling down here. Okay, it's employment type. Here's place of residence. And it's comparing 3 to 15. So again, if we look at our database, our database actually has 18. So that's, looks like we have a bug. Back to Notepad. Okay, one thing I did not mention earlier that I should have is that when you are running your business rules in this test mode here inside the composer, and you do right-click test, whatever file it reads in is going to be written back out to the same place. So sometimes what you need to do is make a backup of your file before you run this. In my case, it's not causing any problem, but just so you'll know this. So when you say here add instance, and I have a sample loan 2, if I go look at that, my sample loan 2 now has these fields added. And so this can be good for testing, but it can also wipe out your test data if you're not careful, if you don't know that it's going to update the same file. In our case, these are pretty much input fields, and then these 4 are pretty much output fields. So there's really no problem. So I noticed that still my residency rules are not firing. So when I look at the business rule composer here, I did a copy of all these trace into Notepad, right? And in Notepad, I'm looking for the word minimum, and I don't see it there. So basically, I know that it's not using that variable, and therefore that rule is never really firing, which is kind of strange. So this is equal to null, and it's never set to, it should say residency status is valid or residency status is invalid. So for some reason, it's really not getting the data that it needs, and it's not performing all the rules. So I'm going to research that and come back with an answer in another video. I'll show you one thing that I tried here is in this Neil demo, which is my 1 = 1 rule. I tried this. I said assert minimum time in current residence. Assert says basically I want to pull this fact into my memory, and I was hoping that would go out to the database and cause it to be read. I guess the other tool we could use here is SQL Profiler to see if it's actually reading the database or not. The other thing I tried was, by the way, I closed and reopened the composer, and I also stopped the rule engine service. Let me just show you that real quick. So I'm going to do this one more time just to be sure that maybe it had some of these facts in memory and it wasn't clearing them. So by clearing that and then restart the composer, do we get the same result or not? So now I've reopened the composer and I do a test again. And now I have to re-add my instance file, which was sample 2. And before I run it again, I just want to make sure it has numbers here. So place of residence is 45. So that rule should fire. And back here we click test. And again, to make it easier to read, I'm going to do a Control A and go take this to Notepad. And then I'm going to go to the top and find minimum. which I don't find. And I also set the value in the database to 55, which was a number that's less likely to occur in this file. It just so happens to my GUID this time had a 55 in it. And I never see the number 55 all by itself. So what that's showing you is here in the database, I set that to minimum of 55 months. And we never saw that it actually, when it actually compares two fields, it says here like here, left value is 10, right value is 0. So I expect it to say somewhere like left or right value is 55. So I know that it's not running those two rules. And let me just show you again the concept. Remember, we have a negative rule and a positive rule, and they should be opposites of each other. So it should be this rule runs, or its negative equivalent, this one should run. And neither one is running. Therefore, that tells me there's still some issue with our vocabulary that we set up here. So I'll have to research that and follow up with that in another video.